So, hello everyone. My name is Melroy, and I would like to thank David for giving me this opportunity to present. But mostly, I'd also like to thank all of y'all for taking the time to listen to me talking. Because today, what I'm going to talk about is a bit about what we do at the Australian Access Federation, or the AAF, and what sort of services we provide to the national research infrastructure providers like Microscopy Australia and some of the other ones like ANSTO and the others. So before we get started, what I'd like to do is just acknowledge the traditional owners, and I'd like to acknowledge the Jagara and Turrbal people who are the traditional custodians of the land where I'm in, and pay respects to their elders past and present, and also extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, the primary goal of AAF is to enable seamless access online for the Australian research and education sector. And we can do that by what we do is allow researchers to use their existing institutional credentials. So they don't have to remember an extra username and password. They can just use their institution username and password to access shared resources and services. And they can do that across national or international boundaries. And the best thing is, because you don't have to remember additional usernames or passwords, you don't have to stress too much about figuring out what your next password is going to be. So now AAF delivers what is called a National Trust and Identity Federation. And it is one of the world-leading trust and identity infrastructures for the Australian higher education and research sector. But AAF also innovates within the trust and identity space, because this is particularly important within research sector, since researchers often use and employ cutting-edge technologies. Some of these aren't available commercially or will not work with commercial identity solutions. So what AAF does is it works within the trust and identity space, looking at emerging technologies, looking at standards, policies, and frameworks to enable researchers to use the Trust and Identity Federation. And AAF also enables access to key institutional and national infrastructures for researchers. That is because we see research as being borderless. What that means is you do not necessarily need to be in a particular location or be in that institution to be able to access those resources. You should be able to do it from wherever you are, as long as you've got the right connection. And that means irrespective of your location, as researchers, you can access national and institutional research infrastructure and services. AAF also helps protect and provide awareness by ensuring that the right person can access research infrastructure. So it's not just anyone who can access research infrastructure, but only those who've got access can access that particular infrastructure, and that their research is protected. Trust and identity helps strengthen integrity and reproducibility, which are some of the things we'll talk about fair research. And this is becoming a big issue because research is now almost data-driven. But all of this, we are only able to achieve it through engagement with our communities, our research facilities, our fellow research infrastructure providers like Microscopy Australia, like ARDC, like ANSTO, and our peers internationally. So all this is good, but why exactly do we need an identity federation? For starters, the Identity Federation allows interconnected and efficient research while enabling collaboration between researchers and their organization, and also providing secure access. And when we say secure access, the idea is because you'll be using your institutional username and password, and that institutional username and password you only get after someone at the institution cited a verifiable identity document. So it is the level of assurance with that sort of access, with that sort of credential is quite high. And what that means is that can then be used to access certain resources because you now know that the person who's accessing that particular infrastructure resource is who they say they are. Right? And AAF is also a trust and identity federation leader because one of the things that we do is we connect Australian teachers, students, and researchers to national and international teaching, learning, and research infrastructure. And what the Federation helps them do is safely and securely access online tools and services using institutional credentials. Now, there are over 100 organizations that are connected to the Federation, and that kind of equates to about 1.5 million users. And over 300 national services have enabled access through the Federation. And we also globally connect to over 80 different trust and identity federations worldwide, just like the AAF. And what that means is because of that global connectivity, our researchers, as in Australian researchers, have had access to large international research infrastructure, such as DARIA for digital humanities, Elixir for life sciences, and LIGO, which discovered gravitational waves in recent years. Now, this wouldn't have been possible without the Trust and Identity Federation that AAF operates. And what it also does is it provides the underpinning connectivity for many of Australia's national critical research infrastructure services, including ORID, which is urban, regional, and social science research. And what they do is they look into research within the community. They've been quite active over the last couple of years, especially looking into the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Then there is Murchison Wide Field Array, which is a precursor to the Square Kilometre Array, and the Australian Biocommons. We also help ARNet users connect to CloudStore through the AAF. And with ARDC, we enable access to their thematic research data commons, as well as the Health Studies Australian National Data Access Programs. And AAF's also considered to be a leader globally. And even nationally, AAF has staff representation on the National Data Commissioner's Technical Advisory Group. And internationally, AAF staff have chaired and led steering committees and projects across Asia and Europe. But AAF is not just about the Identity Federation. As David mentioned, one of the things AAF also does is it runs the Australian Orchid Consortium and is the consortium lead. As consortium lead, AAF helps consortium members integrate ORCID within their systems. We also help them with communication, so communicating how those systems are integrated, the benefits to their researchers, benefits to executives, benefits to managers and vice chancellors, how we also help them with policy as well as help them leverage whatever benefits they can obtain with an ORCID integration. Now, currently, the Australian Orchid Consortium has 42 members, of which 38 are universities. We've got 2 research institutions, so that's CSIRO and ANSTO, which is the Australian Nuclear Science Technology Organization, and then 2 of the big funders, that is the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council, are also a part of the consortium. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of what ORCID is, here's a quick refresher. ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. It is a unique and persistent identifier for researchers. Unique in that no 2 researchers will have the same ORCID ID. And it is persistent because it is a long-lasting reference to a researcher. Typically, it is expected that a researcher will use their ORCID ID throughout their entire research career. What the ORCID ID does is it points to a record in the ORCID registry, which generally contains a list of the researcher's affiliations and contributions to research. Researchers control the information that is displayed in their ORCID record. But ORCID is not just the identifier. So ORCID is also the organization that hosts the registry. I know it is a bit confusing. So what I generally do is I refer to the identifier as ORCID ID and to the organization as ORCID. Now, ORCID is a not-for-profit organization and has been conceived and built by the research community for the research community to help with research and name disambiguation. Because ORCID's vision is a world where everyone who participates in research, scholarship, or innovation, they'd like them to be uniquely identified and connected to all their contributions and affiliations across time, border, and disciplines. Now, the Australian Orchid Consortium is more of a community than an actual consortium. We are launched in 2016 with 40 members. And in 22, at the start of 22, we now have 42 members. What we've noticed, though, is ever since the launch of the consortium, number of members who've done an integration has increased from 52% to over 90% at the end of 2021. What was even more interesting was in the middle of 2018, when ARC announced the use of ORCID as part of their grant application process, the number of integrations that organizations have done have risen at a fairly rapid pace. Now, in 2020, what we did at the AAF was we launched a maturity survey assessment, primarily to look at the maturity of our organizations that have done an ORCID integration, to see, to help them understand and evaluate their ORCID integrations, see if they're getting all the benefits from it, what they need to do to get the benefits, and how they can improve on it. 2021, ORCID launched what they call the ORCID member portal, which is a suite of tools that they have developed to help members obtain more value from their ORCID membership. So it has things like Affiliation Manager, which allows for smaller organizations that do not necessarily have the technical capability to assert their researchers' affiliations to ORCID. And it is hoped that in the future, they'd be able to even write their researchers' contributions to their ORCID record. And then they also have what we call the reporting dashboard. So that gives you statistics that show the impact of ORCID IDs and how your ORCID integration is doing. Now, in 2022, along with the Australian Research Data Commons, what the AAF has done is embarked on a report to look at cost-benefit analysis for persistent identifiers within the Australian research sector. So these are some statistics for those of you who are interested in statistics. The consortium has, since the launch of the consortium, ORCID IDs has been constantly increasing in Australia. And at the start of the, when the consortium was launched, when we first checked to see how many Australian or how many ORCID IDs were there that belonged to Australian email addresses or were registered to Australian email addresses, it was around 35 or 36,000. On the 1st of Jan 2022, when we measured again, it's risen all the way to about 176,000. So that's a big jump over the years. And as you can see, it has been steadily increasing. But it's not just the ORCID IDs have increasing, because the reason they've been increasing is the number of ORCID integrations that have also increased and kept pace with it. So our members have done about 59% of vendor integrations, whereas 41% of those integrations were bespoke or custom integrations. So why should research infrastructure services like Microscopy Australia or even the Australian Research Data Commons or ANSTO, for example, enable seamless authentication and ORCID integrations? The simple answer is it's all about research being fair, that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Another reason is for transparency. What you would like to know, or what people would like to know, is who has accessed what service in order to establish research reproducibility and provenance. The confidence in high level of assurance that comes with it, while being able to disambiguate researcher, means that researchers will be acknowledged for the sort of contribution that they make to the scholarly body of knowledge. Secondly, comprehensiveness, because there is a lot more information about researchers who have received grants, used research facilities, written publications, and are employed by organizations. Now, this information, it's present, but they're not necessarily always displayed, or it doesn't necessarily always come up when researchers access particular instruments. Having seamless access and using same username and password across all services means that it is now interconnected along with persistent identifiers like ORCID. And what that means is you can then look at interconnectivity between various entities like research organizations, infrastructure providers, funding agencies, and publishers. Then there is trusted reporting. You now have access to data that you can trust, data that comes from sources of truth. You've got greater confidence in your reporting. If you've got information that's directly coming from publishers about papers or journals that researchers have published, you've got information coming in from funders about what grants they have received. You have information coming in from universities or organizations that employ these researchers. What it means is that you can have confidence in what you're reporting. And if you've been asked to report on proportion of research conducted by Australian researchers or international researchers, what sort of research, what research is rated at world-class, what research used Australian research infrastructure, as well as collaborations between different organizations, you'd be able to do it. But more importantly is you'll have a lot more confidence in that report and in the data that underpins the report. This is an example of some of the work that I've done using persistent identifiers. So what you can see over here is a collaboration network that is based on COVID-19 research. And we built the collaboration network using persistent identifiers like ORCID. The idea behind it, or the premise behind it, is because ORCID is a persistent identifier, which connects and links to other persistent identifiers. The linkages provide rich information from within the metadata to help understand various issues. So what we did was we looked at how organizations collaborate with each other or collaborated with each other during 2020 and early 2021. So this is an example. And now, does anyone have any questions? In case if you feel you don't have questions at the moment, but you may have questions later, that's my email address. Please feel free to send me an email and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
Thank you, Melroy. That was very interesting. Emily actually has a question. So Emily, do you want to ask the question or do you want me to read what's in the chat? Okay, I'm gonna just read then. So it's a very interesting question because I think AAF authentication has come up several times in conversation in the past. Is it possible for someone using university services who is not affiliated with the university to obtain an AAF login? For example, if a group wanted to give someone access to resources, or would they need to be added as a university adjunct member or something else?
It's a very interesting question. If you'd have asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said that, yes, they would need to be added, but what they can do is now some universities have the ability to provide guest access to researchers who are not necessarily part of the university themselves. So they don't necessarily need to be affiliated to the university, but they can get guest access. It's just that whoever is the identity administrator at the university needs to provision that. So they don't necessarily need to be added as a university adjunct member or anything. They could just be added. It's just a like staff access. And that would mean they would then get the access, but it needs to come from the university and it can be configured. And then, yes, the person will have that AAF login, so as to speak. Okay. Does that answer your question, Emily?
Let's assume so. Otherwise, we can. Yeah, she's happy with the answer. Is there any university or any like research institute that is not a member of or affiliated with AAF?
As far as I'm aware, all universities are AAF members. So AAF itself is a not-for-profit organization, and it was started off by universities. So all universities are members, and all the members elect what is called a board of directors. So the board of directors, you'll have members nominate people from within them to stand for the board, and then they'll have an election and everything. So at the end of the day, because it's all the CIOs from universities that are on the AAF board, the direction that AAF goes in is what the universities feel is the best direction for them to go with regards to identity and access.
So in that regard, it's like AARNet.
I don't know. I don't know how AARNet operates, but
your shareholders or stakeholders are the universities.
Are the universities. So it's whatever the universities want us to do mostly is generally the things that we work on, which is why, like I mentioned, the bit about being innovative, because a lot of researchers, when they use latest technology, commercial identity solutions do not always necessarily take that into account and cannot deal with it. So that's where an AAF can actually help with working around it, designing policy and framework and technology to use it and provide access.
Okay, thanks. Chung Han has a question. If I would like to integrate with some certain software applications, which protocols are supported by AAF as well as ORCID login? Or which ones would be preferred by AAF, say OpenID Connect, Shibboleth, sorry, I don't know.
That's fine. Okay, so that's another nice question, because again, in the past, AAF completely worked on Shibboleth, SAML, and a Java-based version of SAML. But we've now developed services where if you've got OpenID Connect and want to authenticate using OpenID Connect, you can do so. You can do it via Shibboleth, you can do it via SAML. If you want to use the ORCID login, if you want to use ORCID login as an authentication method, that's another thing that we can help with. So yes, all those options that you've suggested, we should be able to work with all of them. It just depends on what sort of application it is and what's the criteria for that application to work, as in, do you just need it to connect users to the application? Does it need to does the application itself need to connect to other local or international services? But that is something, if it is something you'd like to do, let us know. More than happy to sit down and have a chat and take it from there.
Any more questions? I actually have a question about ORCID. So yeah, I mean, it's a great success. So how have you managed to convince so many universities and the ARC in such a short time to get on board? Because I'm thinking, like, for other persistent identifiers, the uptake has not been so quick and so broad.
To be fair, the convincing was already done by the time the consortium was launched, as in, there was an agreement around the table by the peak bodies. So the Council of Australian University Librarians, then CORDIT, that is the Australian Universities Director of IT, Universities Australia, and ARMS, all these peak bodies, that is the Research Management Society, and ARC and NHMRC, they all came together and decided that ORCID was doing good work with regards to researcher disambiguation, and it made sense to nationally support it and have a consortium based in Australia. And because there was a level of agreement at a higher level where everybody's like, it's a good thing, we need to get on board with it, we need to implement it. It was easy to launch the consortium. Once the consortium was launched, then the hard part was trying to convince people to actually get an integration happening, because the idea was, oh yes, we've joined the consortium, so we should just get the benefits. But the way I like to think of it is, when you join a gym, to get fit, you don't automatically get fit just by getting a gym membership. You have to go in and you have to exercise to see results. And that was the same thing with the consortium, is just joining the consortium is not going to give you benefits. You need to do an integration. You need to get your researchers to sign in with ORCID ID wherever possible. You need to get them to, and it's keeping onto this message consistently and regularly, letting all our members know, and working closely with our funders. So now ARC and NHMRC have both integrated ORCID within their funding systems. ARC is accepting applications. So if you have an ORCID ID, you can log in with your ORCID ID, and then you can select all the publications that you'd like to submit as part of your grant proposal, and it will populate it all in the right fields. It'll come up with that published PDF that in the past used to take a lot of time to actually sit down and format. So yeah, but it has been a long road. I wouldn't say it has been very hard, because when the consortium was formed, there was understanding already that we want to do it, which is why we're doing it. It's just consistently letting members know that they need to do it, and consistently working with our funders to try and get them to implement it. Because as soon as ARC decided to do it, almost everyone who didn't even want to look at an integration decided to look at an integration. Only because they started realizing how easy it is going to make it for their researchers. And in the latest engagement and impact review report and the ERA report that has come back from ARC, one of the things that is recommended is the use of persistent identifiers like ORCID and DOIs to help reduce reporting burden and used within the grant application process. So that is a recommendation within that report itself. So that's good to see.
So do you see another persistent identifier that would have maybe like a sort of like similar early momentum that maybe could be broadly adopted quite soon?
So the thing is, I would like to see all other identifiers taken up similarly, but there's always going to be issues around it, because most of it is in the back end. With ORCID, because it's researchers, it's always something you can directly interact with. When you're looking at journal publications, when you're looking with data sets, what we need to do is, and when you're even looking at instruments, what we need to do is make sure that the processes we put in automatically have those identifiers added to the metadata.
Mm-hmm.
So that when they then get into a researcher's ORCID record, it just makes it easy for everyone to pull that information. If, as an infrastructure provider, if Microscopy Australia needs to report on what nodes have been used for what sort of research, it would be easier to do that if they had a researcher's ORCID record, but more so if that researcher's ORCID record was populated with the right information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it is, I mean, I would like to see a research activity identifier come up and broadly used within the sector. But again, it is something that ARDC are working with. It is something that internationally a number of other consortia and a number of other countries are looking at. So they have, at least the UK has identified a research activity identifier RAID as one of the 5 persistent identifiers they would like to put their focus behind and try and get it up. So yeah. Yeah,
that'd be great. And I think that's work which is led by the ARDC International.
That is correct. Yes.
That'd be great. Any question? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Melroy, for this very interesting talk. I think because AAF is something like we often hear about, but I'm not sure everyone knows what AAF is and what AAF does, actually. So that was very interesting. So thank you, Melroy, for today's talk. And thank you, everyone, for attending the talk. And the next webinar, All Things Data webinar, will be next month on the 24th of March. And Catherine Hall from UQ and NIF will present a talk on the characterization virtual laboratory, the CVA. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David. Thank you once again, everyone, for the opportunity to speak.
You're
Bye.
welcome.